There was a hope for solidarity in those days after 9/11, when there was a respect again for government of the best kind, for public workers. But very quickly that was corroded, manipulated.
The response turned out to be more important and probably more destructive to the United States than the attack itself had been.
As editor, I was fortunate to call on some of the most humane, cogent writers, analysts, reporters. Jonathan Schell, Letter from Ground Zero, in which he tried to lay out understanding the forces at work that would use this attack as a pretext for more militarism in our society and politics and foreign policy, to argue for a different path. Richard Falk, a great international jurist, was extraordinary in laying out his idea of a just response. Chalmers Johnson wrote about the blowback caused by U.S. foreign policy. William Grider wrote about the war profiteering we were seeing in Washington, those forces again using the tragedy to push through legislation to attack labor, to put through their favorite bills. David Cole was a lucid voice, understanding that our civil liberties were in jeopardy. Naomi Klein argued cogently for humanizing, not dehumanizing, Muslims, to understand the solidarity those who fought for justice and equality could bring as a most effective response to violence and fundamentalism.
There was a large effort on the part of conservatives, self-proclaimed patriots, to kind of really dampen any dissent, to put forward the idea that trying to analyze 9/11 or trying to analyze the causes of these events or the role of the United States in the world was somehow consorting with terrorists, or just that analysis meant justification, that the only thing to say was that, you know, these people are evil and that's it.
In the years after 9/11, I think there was such an unfocused kind of moral panic that the political world became one in which people were afraid to disagree. People were afraid of dissent. And at a time when we needed discussion and dissent more urgently than any time I can think of.
The Bush administration took an attitude that law be damned, that security was above all, international law, constitutional law, statutory law, all was subordinate to the president's inherent authority as commander-in-chief to do whatever he felt was necessary in engaging the enemy. And they said as much explicitly in Justice Department memos. That puts the president above the law and sends a message, as Guantanamo clearly did, that we were acting as if law was irrelevant, did not apply, did not protect human beings.
In the deepest sense, I think the role that 9/11 played and the emotions that are aroused was to distract us from the colossal, real problems that really did threaten the United States and in fact the world.
It also played into increasingly a hostility to immigration, both in the United States and Western Europe, that the Muslim or Islamic immigrants were a kind of not just newcomers into the society, but were sort of a fifth column, agents of some foreign civilization which was working to undermine the West, as it was called.
Racial profiling had been the subject of some discussion, and it was by and large reviled. It was practiced, but it was also by and large denied as a practice. And after 9/11, not only did it proliferate, it became justified by many people in the public at large. It became even fashionable as something to be touted as necessary.
You know, many people say everything changed after 9/11, and there's certainly some truth to that, in that the government responded in a very aggressive way. enacting the Patriot Act in short order, embarking on a widespread campaign of preventive detention of Arab and Muslim foreign nationals here in the United States, over 5,000 locked up in preventive detention measures here in the United States in the first 2 years after 9/11, according to the government's own figures. Broad ethnic profiling campaign undertaken by the government in which it sought out foreign nationals for FBI interviews and for special registration simply because they came from Arab and Muslim countries, not because there was any indication that they were actually involved in or supporting terrorism. And then, we also, as we now know, at the same time, the government was authorizing the National Security Agency to engage in widespread, massive warrantless wiretapping, including of U.S. citizens. It was picking up individuals around the world, sending them to Guantanamo and asserting the right to hold them there forever without any hearings, without any process, without any protections of law, without any access to courts. We had the government for the first time ever in our history officially authorizing torture as a means of interrogating suspects. We had CIA secret prisons opened up, so-called black sites, into which individuals were disappeared, meaning locked up without any acknowledgement that they were locked up to anybody and out of access of anybody, whether it be the International Committee for the Red Cross or the courts.
Governments tend to find civil liberties an inconvenience in wartime. And with the so-called war on terror being announced as a virtually permanent conflict, it raised the question of what the long-term implications of this was going to be for the right to dissent and to other civil liberties, basic liberties of trial by jury, of habeas corpus, of knowing the charges against you if you're held in prison. And those have been pretty seriously violated for certain people, not for the entire society, but certain groups, particularly people from the Arab world or Islamic Americans, and then those, of course, arrested as quote-unquote unlawful combatants, have had their civil liberties stripped away in ways that would have been quite difficult, I think, before 9/11.
Because we made the terrible mistake of calling this a war against terror, when in fact it should be a police action, intelligence, policing, security, diplomacy, we opened the door to a new normal where surveillance, detention, secrecy is part of our life, and it has become a mode of governance.
I also think of the USA Patriot Act as a kind of anti-constitution. We have the US Constitution with all of its ideals of an open democracy on the one hand, and then we have this document which permits a kind of invisible, unaccountable level of government action, of police intrusion, with no clear understanding among the polity at large of what its true ramifications might be.
The notion of a war leads to all sorts of other other implications which may not be relevant. Terrorism may not be a military problem as much as a police problem, a criminality problem. How do you deal with people who commit massive acts of murder?
Fighting against terrorists, you need, you're not going to kill or capture your way to victory. What you need to do is render the group isolated and ultimately irrelevant. And the way you do that is by fighting back where you need to fight back, but doing so in a way that takes the high road, that is very, very sensitive to feedback, that tries not to enrage those who might be sympathetic to the other side. And that's the way you isolate the group until it becomes a kind of an irrelevancy. Unfortunately, the Bush administration approach, which was to, run roughshod over people's basic human dignity and to ethnically profile and and treat people as suspects simply because they were Arab or Muslim had the opposite effect.
The Afghan war was popular, but the one in Iraq was really not very popular. But now both are unpopular. And they go on by some curious momentum, some kind of terrible inertia, even in the spite of their unpopularity. Nevertheless, President Obama and other politicians don't dare to really as boldly pull the plug as would be necessary to face up to the real disasters that have unfolded there.
I think we've committed ourselves to a path of something like eternal war. I think the wars that we're engaged in might not have been so enormously expensive and so enormously globally pervasive on-the-ground investments if there had been some wiser minds at the helm. I worry that it has become a monument not just to the sadness of that time, but a monument to the necessity for extreme measures, the necessity for continued surveillance, the necessity for never trusting one's neighbors. And that in that sense it's become a glib kind of excuse in certain sectors of our political conversation, rather than the monument to the tragedy of not having had the engagement and the foresight and the intelligence that might have taken us down a somewhat different path, even in the face of great lunacy and tragedy.
Jonathan Schell wrote a brilliant cover story in the run-up to the war in Iraq. It was a cover story called The Other Superpower, and it was about the transnational opposition of millions of people around the globe to the war in Iraq. And though in the end the Bush administration did lie us, did take us into this war, I think we see in that other superpower the beginnings of what we see emerge now in the Arab world with the Arab awakening, with people in motion in this country protesting the violation of their economic rights and their rights. And that is where the power of the powerless is beginning to reassert itself at 9/11 at 10.